Darkness Falls. I'm your host Adnan. This is episode 1, the Villisca Axe Murders. Villisca is a small town in Iowa, United States. In the early 1900s, it was a flourishing town of a population of around 2,000 people. It was a bustling railroad town where dozens of passengers and freight trains stopped every day. The town had several hotels, restaurants, and theaters as well. The town's history will always be tainted with the infamous axe murders of 1912. The victims consisted of the Moore family and two of Mary Catherine Moore's friends who were staying over at the Moores. The Moores lived in a modest two-story building. They were a well-known family and were well liked in the community. The Moore family comprised of Josiah Moore and Sarah Moore, their children Harmon, Catherine, Paul, and Boyd Moore. Josiah Moore was a prominent businessman of Villisca. The Moores were a member of the Presbyterian Church. On 9 June Sunday 1912, they attended the Children's Day service at the church. Accompanying them were the children of the neighbors, Ina and Lena Stillinger, who would be staying over at the Moore residence. They arrived at home around 10 p.m. according to eyewitnesses. Shortly after midnight, the killer entered the home with Joe Moore's axe, which was lying in the backyard. According to the reconstruction attempted by the county coroner, the killer went up the stairs in the Moore's bedroom and bludgeoned Joe and Sarah Moore to death. The killer brought the axe down on Joe's head and he did the same to Sarah. The upswing of the axe caused gouge marks on the ceilings. He then went to the next room and murdered the Moore children. The Moore children and parents did not have any defensive wounds, suggesting that they were totally asleep during the killings. Afterwards, the killer descended downstairs and proceeded to murder the Stillinger sisters who were living in the guest bedroom. Lena Stillinger might have just woken up before she was hit with the axe, as she had some defensive wounds on her. It was assumed that after murdering all the victims, the killer went back to each of the victims and brought the axe down 20 to 30 times, making them all unrecognizable. The crime scene has been described as extremely bizarre and gruesome, and to this day it remains as one of the grisliest crimes ever committed in Iowa history. Some of the strange things that were promptly noticed by investigators were that all the victims had their faces covered by bedclothes. Something which can be seen as more bizarre was that the killer tried to cover all the mirrors in the house using clothes from the dresser drawers. He also wrapped an uncooked 2-pound slab of bacon with a towel and left it on the floor. There was a bowl of water filled with blood and it seemed that the killer tried to wash off his bloody hands. There was a keychain beside the slab of bacon which presumably belonged to the killer. A plate of untouched food was left on the table. He also covered the curtains. 2 windows which didn't have curtains seemed to have been covered with clothes. 2 unlit kerosene lamps were found at the foot of the bed of the Moore parents and Stillinger girls. All these suggest that the killer spent quite some time in the house after the murders, making the whole incident look more horrific. The axe was lying on the floor and was partially cleaned. Probably during some time near the dawn, the killer left the house, locking the door behind him. By 7:30 a.m. in the morning, an elderly neighbor, Mary Peckham, was concerned by the unusual quietness of the Moore home. There seemed to be absolutely no sign of life. She did not get any response after calling out to the Moores. Afterwards, she let the chickens out and telephoned Joe's brother Ross and asked him to investigate. Joe's brother Ross Moore was a local druggist. He found the door locked and entered the house using a copy of the key. Ross was investigating inside as Mary was waiting on the porch. As soon as Ross discovered the Stillinger sisters' bodies in the guest bedroom, he came out calling for Villisca's Marshal, Hank Horton. Horton went inside the house and came outside saying that there was a person lying dead in each of the bed. He went on to call the sheriff and bring in the coroner. The crime scene hadn't been preserved properly and many people went in and out during the day. Around 100 curious townspeople moved around the house, destroying any potential evidence. The murder shook the town of Villisca to the core. Everybody was on edge, every lock in town was bought. When darkness fell, the fear grew among the townspeople that the axe killer might strike again. Families partnered with their neighbors to stand shotgun guard all night, and windows were nailed shut. People were even seen carrying weapons openly. People looked at each other with suspicion as the investigation went on. The Moore-Stillinger funeral services were held in Villisca's town square on June 12, 1912, with thousands in attendance. National Guardsmen blocked the street as the hearse moved toward the firehouse where 8 victims lay. Their caskets, not on display during the funeral, were later carried on several wagons to the Villisca cemetery for burial. During the course of the investigation, several suspects were identified. The initial suspect was Frank Jones, who was a tough local businessman and state senator. He was also a prominent member of Villisca's Methodist Church. There was a bit of religious division as Frank Jones' Methodists insisted on Frank's innocence, and the Moore's Presbyterian congregation convinced of his guilt. Joe Moore used to work at Frank's store for several years until he started off his own company. This is said to have caused Frank Jones to have a hatred for Josiah Moore. The tensions were further elevated as there were rumors of Joe Moore having an affair with Frank's daughter-in-law. Another theory was that Frank Jones hired a man named William Mansfield to commit the murders. The name of William Mansfield came from a tip and investigators started looking into him. The Burns Detective Agency and Detective Wilkerson publicly named Mansfield as their prime suspect. There were similar axe murders, and Detective Wilkerson believed that Mansfield was responsible for those as well. Detective Wilkerson also thought that Mansfield was responsible for murdering his own family in Illinois. In 1916, Wilkerson convinced a grand jury to open an investigation, and Mansfield was arrested and brought to Montgomery County in Iowa. However, payroll records provided an alibi for Mansfield. He was released due to lack of evidence and won a lawsuit against Wilkerson, and was awarded $2,250. Wilkerson believed that pressure from Jones resulted not only in Mansfield's release but also in the subsequent arrest and trial of Reverend Kelly. Another prime suspect was Reverend George Kelly. Kelly was an English-born traveling minister. Kelly had a history of mental illness, reportedly having suffered a mental breakdown as an adolescent. He was also known as a sexual deviant as he was accused of peeping and asking several young women and girls to pose nude for him during his adult life. He was teaching at the Children's Day services at the Presbyterian Church, which the Moore family attended on 9 June 1912. At the morning following the murder, Kelly boarded on a train and reportedly told fellow travelers about the murders, even though the bodies hadn't been discovered yet. He soon became obsessed with the murders. The authorities were alerted about him after he sent rambling letters to state and local investigators, private detectives, and relatives of the victims. It also came up that Kelly had returned to Villisca a week later and had shown great interest to the murders, even posing as a Scotland Yard detective to obtain a tour of the Moore house. He developed a reputation for odd behavior. He had also been convicted of sending obscene material through the mail and had spent time in a mental hospital. Kelly was indicted by a grand jury in 1917. He was interrogated repeatedly and actually signed a confession in which he stated, "I killed the children upstairs first and the children downstairs last. I knew God wanted me to do it this way. Slay utterly came to my mind and I picked up the axe, went into the house and killed them." However, he recanted his statement later and the passengers of the train changed their statements as well. The first trial resulted in a hung jury and he was acquitted in the second trial. By the time the trial began, a majority of Montgomery County citizens were convinced that Kelly was being framed as a part of a conspiracy led by Frank Jones. They also believed that Jones tried to use his money and influence to pick the jury. After the murders, every transient became a suspect as well. Andy Sawyer was one such person. No real evidence has linked Sawyer to the murders, but his name came up on grand jury testimonies. Sawyer was a transient who moved from job to job, and on the morning of the murder, he gained a job for the Burlington Railroad. Sawyer seemed strange and was very interested in the axe murders. He seemed obsessed with a newspaper headlining the axe murders. Sawyer always seemed to be on edge and slept with his axe near him. He talked a lot about the murders and told the work crew that he may be looked on as a suspect. His boss, Dyer, handed him over to the sheriff. Sawyer was dismissed as a suspect when it was found that he was in Osceola, Iowa on the night of the murder. During 1911 and 1912, a chain of axe murders kept happening in the Midwest, especially in towns near the train lines, suggesting that a transient killer may be at work. In 1913, a pattern had been pointed out by Special Agent Matthew McClory to the Justice Department's Bureau of Investigation. According to his theory, Henry Moore, a convict, was suspected as a serial killer. He was convicted of the murder of his mother and grandmother several months after the murders in Villisca, his weapon of choice being an axe. The cases were similar and had striking resemblances, but the series of axe murders remained a puzzle. No substantial evidence was ever found against Henry Moore as well. Over the years, the house has had several owners and few businesses used it as an office. The house was purchased by Darwin and Martha Lynn in 1994. They planned to turn it into a historic museum. The Lynns renovated the house, and in 1998 the house was added to the National Register of Historic Places. Soon after they bought the house, the Lynns started getting requests from paranormal investigators wanting to investigate the house. There were numerous reports of hauntings and has occurred in the house. Soon the house turned into a paranormal hotel. The first paranormal investigators started visiting the house in 1999, and since then they have declared it haunted. Visitors have claimed to hear giggles and screams. They have also witnessed movements and seen shadows around the house. A strange fog could also be seen at times moving from one room to another. Visitors seem to show abnormal behavior as well. In one particular incident in 2014, a 37-year-old man from Wisconsin went to the house with his friends for a paranormal investigation. He stabbed himself in the chest and was rushed to the hospital quickly and was saved. There was no apparent motive for it. It is constantly ranked in top 10 most haunted locations in the United States. Both day tour and overnight stays are available these days. The price for an individual daytime tour ranges from $12 to $5. The overnight tour is $428 for a group of 6 people. It has become a very fascinating place for history buffs, paranormal, and true crime enthusiasts. Thank you for listening to Darkness Falls. I hope you have enjoyed this episode. Please subscribe and share it with your friends and family. You can also follow Darkness Falls Pod at Instagram and Darkness Falls on Facebook for more updates. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time.